I think this is a perfect time to start because my advisor, Jessica Symes, is here, and I'm very thankful for her help on this project. So I'm going to start out. New Zealand decriminalized sex work in 2003, which has really improved conditions in the industry. However, migrant workers on temporary visas are prohibited from working specifically in the sex industry. So this presentation is less about sex work itself and more about what decrim has taught us about socially controlling a persistently stigmatized workforce and the consequences of this legal exclusion and other forms of inequality. So as an intern at the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective last spring, I learned about how decrim has reduced the incarceration and exploitation of sex workers, as well as the health and safety risks in the industry. However, I also observed the impacts of urban inequality on street workers and how criminalizing migrant workers has limited their ability to combat violence and exploitation. So this expanded my questions to broader questions about social control, like what social factors moderate the benefits of decrim and what external legal and macroeconomic forces shape these redesigned forms of social control. So the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003 decriminalized sex work, including for clients and street workers. However, migrants were excluded from decrim under Section 19, which was put in place as an anti-trafficking measure. FOSTA SESTA in the US criminalized online advertising, which shut down Backpage.com, which was the most popular site used by sex workers in New Zealand as well. So US policies in general, they conflate sex work with trafficking while offering very little support for people experiencing harm in the industry. And these policies have increasingly influenced New Zealand's shift from kind of the harm reduction intentions of decrim to a punitive enforcement of Section 19. So to discuss theory briefly, I use Foucault's theory of panopticism to understand how social control kind of proliferates through multiple institutions even after this removal of the soliciting offense. Intersectionality helps frame how this assumption of criminality is framed or patterned by race, class, gender, legal status, and this label of being a sex worker still. And lastly, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not sex workers are agents or victims, and I kind of contradict or push against that by using agency to understand how my participants navigate their working conditions. This is intersectionality. Navigate their working conditions as workers and not just sex workers. So I interned at NZPC for about 4 months before conducting the majority of my interviews during June of 2018. I then went through several rounds of coding, resulting in themes of this presentation, so the impacts of the PRA, Section 19, FOSTA SESTA, and inequality on sex workers, agency, dignity, and economic security. My sample is somewhat representative of Auckland's industry. It's only 24 people, but there are some limitations, like I didn't talk to cis or trans men. But hearing from citizens, migrants, people of multiple ethnicities, and from a variety of venues helped me better understand this disparate impact of decrim. And all of my participants that I'll talk about have been assigned pseudonyms. So the first theme was that participants overwhelmingly confirmed how the PRA created the legal and cultural conditions possible for sex workers to choose the nature of their work. So when, where, how, with whom, and for how much. Clients and operators' inability to threaten exposure to the police have really reduced several forms of coercion in the industry. Zoe's been working for over 20 years, and she described how she used to be taken advantage of, but now she has the same rights as any other job, and she knows these rights, and so do clients. Of course, all of these benefits are heterogeneously experienced based on racist assumptions about who the empowered sex worker is or who is considered desirable or marketable. For example, white migrant workers in mixed brothels often benefited from the PRA due to this association of whiteness with citizenship. On the other hand, citizens of color often experienced economic or physical backlash from clients who would describe things like she speaks English too well or knows her rights too well for being Asian. Second, the sex industry does not operate in a vacuum from extreme wealth inequality, a diminishing social safety net, or a housing crisis in neoliberal countries like New Zealand, which Eileen mentions here. Some brothels are even starting to charge advertising fees, shift fees, late fees, and linen fees, which can result in a well below minimum wage on quiet nights. Sex work law itself cannot remedy inequality or exploitation, but there are key policies that contradict the goals of equity and labor rights of decrim. So the first is Section 19. One of my participants, Lily, had just started work to help pay her international tuition when police officers entered her brothel while she was taking photographs before she had seen her first client. The police never asked if she was trafficked, only for her visa status. Ultimately, Lily was served a deportation liability notice and returned home to China after learning her case would be unfeasible to appeal. Her record will be clear because she left voluntarily, but she had to change school or change apartments, drop out of school, and live in fear of immigration for several months. 4 of my participants also had several thousands of dollars worth of income stolen from them, which Lavender describes here as a pretty common occurrence for migrant workers. And 2 of my participants, Vera and Eugene, were raped, abused, and exploited by their boss for several months because he kept threatening to call immigration on them. Eventually, NZPC was able to get them back safely to Auckland. Unfortunately, their fear of the police ultimately stopped them from filing evidence about their operator. And this makes sense for them because despite the trauma that Vera and Eugene went through, they still could have been deported because they chose to enter the industry. So the threshold for being supported as a victim of trafficking is so high that expressing any amount of agency renders migrants like Vera and Eugene self-smugglers complicit in their own exploitation, regardless of the amount of violence that occurs. Section 19 also reinforces this idea that sex work is inherently criminal, and this has extremely racialized consequences as well. It also impacts everybody's working conditions, like in mixed brothels that may never call the police for help if a peer is on a temporary visa. So Kai describes that there's sort of this implicit understanding that we still operate as if we are not legal workers, that we don't get any of these rights, that we have shady working situations because of this presumption of continued criminality. Or like people assuming that I'm working on a visa that I'm not allowed to work on. Just some weird, stupid reasoning where management will tell you, we run like this so you all don't get deported. And that's a lie. You don't have to charge us ad fees so we don't get deported. So for citizens, this assumption of criminality also influences their ability to rent, to get housing, to work in other industries, and to travel. Street workers also described how new residents are calling for the policing of street workers, which reinforces assumptions of their criminality. Athena described how the police have this thing of taking photos at the moment. They tried to take her a picture. She said, "Am I under arrest?" They said no, so she could just walk off. And the clients then are often deterred because they see the police and they don't want to come back. They disappear. The second policy is fosta sesta, and its consequences have less to do with punishment and more to do with how suppressing an advertising platform has caused a lot of sex workers to scramble for clients. So even in New Zealand, people are having to go to more exploitative brothels and websites. NewZealandGirls.com then had a near monopoly in New Zealand, leading them to impose higher weekly fees and more stringent controls over sex workers' business practices. So this has not only led people to go to brothels, but brothels then have to charge more and more excessive fees to their workers to pay New Zealand girls. Backpage.com also allowed people to market based on their services rather than their demographic profiles, and there was more flexibility with describing the hours that sex workers could work. New Zealand Girls makes it a lot harder for niche and fetish industry workers to find clients. Secondly, several Maori and Pacific Islander, African and Asian participants described how they were always advertised last, not because there wasn't a market for them, but because people would advertise them based on very Orientalist stereotypes. And trans men and women are excluded from brothels, so this has had a disproportionate on their income security. So we see this disparate impact moderated by race, legal status, and gender. This is maintained through punitive policies like Section 19 and FOSTA SESTA. And markets still profit off of competition rooted in racism, transphobia, and dichotomies of legal versus illegal work. So to conclude, this is not really a critique of the framework of decrim, but of in New Zealand, but of the multiple methods of criminalization that remain and how they foster inequality. So as some activists and policymakers seek to eradicate parts of the industry, I think we should listen to those most attuned to combating violence in sex work. I think broader socioeconomic restructuring is necessary as well, but we can only improve upon the New Zealand model by listening to peer-based organizations like NCPC and thinking about whether this punishment actually reduces harm in the industry. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, Francis.
So you mentioned that Section 19 was first implemented to kind of stop sex trafficking. So by repealing it, you're kind of almost allowing that problem to come up. How would you address then repealing Section 19, but also stopping sex trafficking?
Yeah, so it was put in place as an anti-trafficking measure, kind of under this assumption that if we suppress the demand or the ability for people to come as sex workers, then it will stop happening. But what's on the one hand, New Zealand has not found any victims of trafficking that they've stopped by denying them entry at the border. It's all been people that are consenting to working in the sex industry or consent once they get there. So it hasn't been very effective at stopping trafficking. And by repealing it, then migrant workers that are coerced in the industry or that are choosing to do it would have better ability to be able to seek help if they were harmed in some ways. Right now, it's kind of this criminalization like we have in the US where trafficking is pretty rampant because people have like the criminalization of their work kind of over their heads. So there's no way to really support people that are in this work. And the sex workers are often the ones that are criminalized rather than people that are bringing them here or not telling them about that their work is illegal. So, yeah.
In doing your research, did you ever compare to other decriminalized nations and see if there are any trends?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research comparing the New Zealand model and decrim in New South Wales and Australia, and then legalization, the Nordic model, which is criminalizing clients but not workers. And that's kind of a lot of people agree that criminalizing sex workers isn't very useful because it results in incarceration and they can't use condoms because the police can use that against them. But the Nordic model, I talked to a lot of people that had worked in like Sweden, and then there's a lot of research on how that has a good intention, but it still pushes the industry underground because clients are like scared about the police, so they're going into like darker corners of the street where it's not as safe, or landlords could be criminalized for facilitating sex work by providing them a home, so then sex workers get evicted, or their children are taken from them because they're still seen as victims even if they're choosing to work. And then the other big discussion is about whether or not the state should intervene more, like mandating sexual health checks, like to show that you've had a check, which New Zealand doesn't do. They say it's illegal to not use a condom, but there's different methods of state surveillance that in New Zealand they're kind of against, but I would like to do more research on whether or not this kind of free market, like hands-off approach is really working either, because obviously working conditions aren't like the same for everybody right now. Yeah.
So the Section 19 kind of makes this distinction between immigrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any statistics on how much of the coercive sex trade is domestic versus international in different countries?
In different countries?
Or just in New Zealand. Like how much of coercive sex work was immigrant-based or domestic?
So I don't know about statistics before decrim because it was like there was so much coercion going on because of the law. But now they have no evidence that there's been trafficking of immigrants coming to New Zealand, whereas in other countries there's a lot more evidence of that. Like there's a lot of news stories in places where it's criminalized, so people are being coerced. And New Zealand actually just changed a law to say that trafficking can include domestic trafficking, so there was an underage worker whose mother like forced her into sex work, and that was considered trafficking. So they're really like trying to distinguish between work and coercion, whereas US policies just say that all prostitution is inherently trafficking. So the statistics aren't even like useful because it means that we have this really high number of victims here, but that's because we group all of the migrants that are choosing to work compared to, but then the only people that are supported have to like meet basically like slavery-like conditions is how they describe it. And so there's this like in-between that happened with some of my participants. I think that's everything.